Okay, folks, you might have been wondering why I haven't been putting out videos as consistently as I have in the past. I'm usually pretty good about putting out one video every 3 days. I've been doing this for about 10 months now, and I just have to confess, I've been on vacation. I've been vacationing on the continent of Ivalice. Now, if you've never seen the continent of Ivalice, you might be wondering, what, is that south of Antarctica? No, it is a fictional continent on the video game setting of Final Fantasy XII. Final Fantasy XII is what I like to commonly refer to as the last console video game I'm ever going to play. I've been a console video game player since, actually, it would be the late 1970s. Because the first video game console I ever had was an Atari 2600 that my dad brought home one day back when we were still out living in California. And golly, I tell you what, being an only child with a video game console in the early days of video gaming, like with the Atari 2600, not as fun of a time as you might think. I mean, I made the most of it, but the fact was is that Dad didn't have much time for playing video games, and most of the video games that were out there were two-player. On an Atari 2600, the first two video games I remember we had were Combat, which was you versus someone else in either a tank setting or a plane setting, a jet setting, some place where you're doing various kinds of combat. And then there was another game called Video Olympics, which would be you versus someone else in 21 different variations of Pong. And then you've got games like Outlaw, which is you versus an opponent in a Western shooting type game. All of these are great if you have someone to play with. Unfortunately, I was an only child and didn't have that many friends back in those days. So yeah, I spent a lot of time trying to figure out how to turn two-player games into one-player games, which is just sad. So later on, I graduated from the Atari 2600 to the original Nintendo Entertainment System. That was the days of Super Mario Brothers when that first came out. Excite Bike was another great game that I got. And the nice thing about those is that they're one player games. So it wasn't like I had a whole bunch of. The AI had gotten better by that point, to the point where the computer could play against you at least in some rudimentary fashion. So pro wrestling, that was one that I had a lot of fun with. Nintendo Tennis was another one that I had a little fun with because and I was actually in playing tennis at the time, so I gravitated to that some. And of course, the games got more complex. The Mega Man games, and finally the Final Fantasy games appeared on the Nintendo Entertainment System, and that continued into the Super NES, where they came out with Final Fantasy II and Final Fantasy III. Final Fantasy III was actually an adaptation of Japan's Final Fantasy VI, I think, and Final Fantasy II, if I recall correctly, was an adaptation of Japan's Final Fantasy IV. So they skipped some games in the meantime that would not come out until the PlayStation arrived. And I'd never owned a PlayStation, but that is where the Final Fantasy games migrated to. I eventually bought a PlayStation 2 because the PlayStation 2 had the capacity to play DVDs, and I needed a DVD player at the time. Now, this was in the very early days of the technology. So I bought myself, I want to say it was around 1997 ish or so. I bought myself a PlayStation 2, and I bought a couple of DVDs for that, Spider Man the Collector's Edition, and The Thing, which is one of my favorite all time horror movies. So after buying that, that's pretty much what I've stuck with. I have not gotten any console games past the PlayStation 2, mainly because that was when computer gaming was starting to take off, and I got pretty heavily involved in the MMORPG called City of Heroes, which was a comic book style based superhero role playing game that you could play, multiple interactions with various players. It came out around the same time as World of Warcraft, but it was in a superhero setting. And since I've been a long time comic book reader, I figure, I'll go for that. And I played that until it finally shut down some years ago, which was very sad. Although they were ruining the game. They were making revisions to the game, updating it, updating some of the older introductory levels in ways that were just terrible. I mean, I played the introductory levels that they had originally done so many times. I was so familiar with them, and then they just came and screwed the whole thing up. So I'm kind of sad that it's gone, but not so sad that it's gone. And I'm sure there's plenty of YouTube videos if I ever want to go down nostalgia lane. They do have another MMORPG out there called Champions Online that maybe someday I'll get into, but I tried it out one time, wasn't real impressed with the combat system, and so it just never took off with me. And they didn't have very good crafting at the time either. All that being said, I've never gone to PlayStation 3. I've never done any Xbox. I've never done any Nintendo 64 and up. I don't even know what the latest things are at. I think they're coming out with the PlayStation 5 now, and now there's this Xbox Live. I have no idea where Nintendo is at. And really, when you get older like me, I mean, I'm approaching 50, you don't have time for this kind of video game crap anymore. I mean, I just played Bully, which was an excellent PlayStation game. It takes you back to high school, and basically you're a tough kid who's going around trying to navigate among the various factions and run missions that get you in good with the nerds and the jocks and the preppies and all that kind of stuff. It's actually really a pretty good game. There were only a couple of times that I got stuck playing the game and had to rely on walkthroughs online to help me out. But very immersive, very imaginative. I explored pretty much everything I wanted to do in that game. And then they give you, a kind of an endless summer quest in where you can go back through and play anything that you didn't do in the first time around. So if you're backward compatible to that kind of game, then I would recommend that. But then I also played Final Fantasy X, which was one of the most hailed games. I was going to play Final Fantasy VII, but I just got bored by it. Basically, I had a whole bunch of PlayStation and PlayStation 2 games, and during the lockdown was the perfect time for me to just go back through and say, okay, I want to do my last video gaming during this period and just be done with this portion of my life, because I need to focus the rest of my life on more constructive pursuits, obviously. And this is the last of them. This Final Fantasy 12, this Vacation in Ivalice that I'm taking. Oh, by the way, in the Final Fantasy series, one of the best video games that they have in terms of the story content is Final Fantasy Tactics. Now, that game, I can't believe, looking back through the years that I have played video games, I cannot believe how much time out of my life I have sunk into these games, just from childhood upward. I mean, I used to play these games for hours and hours and hours on end. I mean, even going back to the Atari 2600, there was a game I remember, Empire Strikes Back, that they came out with for the Atari 2600. And the only thing there was to that game was you were in Luke Skywalker's snowspeeder flying around those AT-AT walkers and shooting them down. And you would do that for hours on end until it just got too fast, and you eventually lost. There were other Star Wars games were pretty good on that console. Actually, there was one called Jedi Academy, and that was using a paddle game. Of course, the paddles lose their sensitivity over time, and so that kind of sucked. But oh my gosh, there were so many times Pitfall and Mega Mania, and I look back at all that time that I spent doing that. And if you have kids and they're growing up, and if you're letting them sink their lives into these video games, oh my gosh, don't. I'm just amazed at how much time I spent on video games, how much time I spent on television. All of these hours and hours stack up to lost time. I mean, you're sinking yourself into images of other people's lives, into stories that other people have written for you. And that's one of the draws of entertainment, visual entertainment, like movies and television and video games, is that it kind of draws you in to a narrative that you can be a part of. And so much stuff in our lives doesn't really fit any narrative that really intrigues or interests us. And so we get bored with life and we want to escape into these entertainment settings where the narrative structures have been set up to entertain us and make us feel important. And that's what video games do, especially because what are you usually doing in a video game? You're like trying to save the world, you're trying to, conquer the evil warlord, you're trying to bring down the empire, you're trying to do all these great and wonderful and noble things that you'll be lauded for and given medals for, like at the end of. I'm very spoiler averse, so I won't be saying that, but you probably know what movie I'm talking about. You've got to, if there's one piece of advice I would give to anybody who's raising kids today, it's to make sure that people don't get so wrapped up in the narratives of the entertainment industry that they neglect the narratives of their own lives. You can, you have to at some point figure out what you want the story of your life, or what the story of your life is going to be. And yet at the same time, I look at that and I think, yeah, there's a note of caution to be had for that too, because I think one of the things that I actually ironically learned from comic books, and this was mainly from reading Brian Michael Bendis in his series Powers, is that life is not a story more often than not. Life is just a series of events and problems that you're having to react to and solve. And when you try and put that in some sort of narrative structure, is when you start to drive yourself crazy, because you want to take this "what's it all about" Charlie Brown approach and put that on your life, so that your life becomes this video game type struggle against evil. And when you evaluate your life in terms of that, so often you're going to fall short, because how many of us really wind up being heroes in real life? How many of us, have an enemy to combat? I think that's largely one of the things that's driving some of the street violence that you see today, the rioting and the looting and things like that, is that people are revolting against society because they feel like the society we live in is some sort of common enemy that they can now join in and band together. And it happens on the right wing too. And you've got the organization like the Proud Boys, who are seeing the idiots on the left like Antifa rising up and saying, okay, well, there's our enemy, and we're going to form a group and we're going to combat the evil of this enemy. And oh gosh, it's narratives like that, and being unable to break out of those narratives that leads to the psychological stress that leads to people to do stupid things, like in the case of Trump's election, screaming on the White House lawn during the inauguration, or in the case of the Capitol riots, storming the Capitol to try and change the narrative into one in which President Trump wins. Narratives are a very powerful thing, and video games and television entertainment are one way of escaping the narrative of your life into the narrative of other people's lives. But be very careful that you don't get captured in the themes of those, because the writers the writers more often than not are not looking to educate you morally in terms of right and wrong. They're looking to educate you morally in terms of what benefits them and what'll keep you drawn in. And maybe it's their ideas of right and wrong that aren't actual right and wrong. So narrative fantasy these days is becoming more and more something that is you don't know what you dip your toe into the pool, and you wind up coming out burned because it's an acid pool. It looked inviting, but it really wasn't. So anyway, I'm I'm kind of getting off into an entertainment and video game digression. I just really wanted to say that if you're wondering why I'm not producing videos as a regular content basis, one thing is that the news is just kind of like and so much of the news today also is stuff that all I could say is pretty much the same thing other people are saying. I mean, like the what do you call it? The massage parlor shootings that just happened. I mean, I could have put out a video on that, but what am I going to add to the conversation? The only thing that I would say is the same thing that I've said in the lot of the Black Lives Matter videos and stuff. Okay, withhold judgment until the facts are in. When the facts are in, then you can start judging what actually happened. Um, but other than that, I mean, what am I going to say? It's the same thing over and over again. Biden's certainly boring. There's not a whole heck of a lot going on with him, other than his near, trip down the stairs. But he's old. Sometimes he's going to stumble. Uh, that's nothing to really shout about. Uh, there's really not a heck of a lot, it seems, going on these days, and maybe that's a good thing. Maybe we need this cool down period, especially now that society may be finally getting back to normal with all the vaccinations going on, and we're going to be out and about and rejoining the world and rejoining the narratives of daily life. Uh, when that happens, don't let narratives like the ones that they put in these stories, don't let those trap you into staying in your bubbles and not rejoining the real world. There's a real world out there. There's a real world out there, and there's things that you can be part of. And I'm not going to say there's always dragons to slay. If you listen to Jordan Peterson like I do, there's dragons in the world, and they're not necessarily the big dragons, but they're little dragons. There's always somebody who's got problems who could use your help, and you could fill a need, and maybe you see something and you wonder, why isn't somebody taking care of that? And then you realize you can be the person who can take care of that. Yeah, if you ever listen to Jordan Peterson, which is a very good way of using your time during this lockdown period, I would advise that. You will hear themes like that. You will hear themes like, if you really want to add meaning to your life, find a problem in the world and set about fixing it. But don't get so wrapped up in it that you start trying to fix it to the extent of making it your own problems, which is leading to rioting and looting and insurrection and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, within boundaries, which is nice. If you haven't seen already, Jordan Peterson's got a complimentary book to his book, 12 Rules for Life, called Beyond Order. So make sure you read the yin and yang of Jordan Peterson. Don't just get half of the story, get the whole thing. In fact, one of the things that I hope to do in the near future is read 12 Rules for Life, and I'll cover that for my Don't Take This as Gospel channel. Okay, this has gone on long enough. Anyway, I hope you can wish me luck slaying whatever dragons there are to slay in Ivalice. It's a long game. It is such a long game, and I am playing it to the fullest extent that I can. Because, like I said, I don't expect to play this or any other video game ever again. And I just want to get this out, carve this out, and move on to other things, onward and upward. And I hope to see y'all as part of that. And please do subscribe if you haven't already, so that in case I am not regular with videos in the future, you can still get notified in those cases. And beyond that, I will talk to you later.